I am David Miller, 45. If you want the short version, I lost my job, my wife left me for my best friend, and I learned how to make them regret both decisions. That's the neat arc folks expect, the logline for a revenge flick. The real life was messier and slower. It got under my skin and lived there. It taught me things I didn't want to know, and then put those lessons to work when the time came. The morning it began, the warehouse conference room smelled like cheap coffee and the recycled fear of men who'd been told their roles were expendable. I'd been at Ridgefield Logistics for 12 years. I knew the value of a clocked-in minute, the art of keeping 20 moving parts from colliding into a crisis. I knew people's strengths and their weaknesses. I thought that knowledge meant something. The CEO thought otherwise. He needed a favor done for a senator's nephew, a seat to give, influence to reciprocate, and a quiet man who'd never rocked the boat was the easiest kind of sacrifice. They handed me the termination letter with a smile. Restructuring, they said. Opportunity for revenue synergy. The words landed like a blow meant to be quick and polite. Later that day I told Jenna in the kitchen and waited for the simple, human response a man hopes for: a hand on my arm, a look that said, "We'll get through it." She folded the dish towel over her hands, bit the corner of the towel, and said, "Maybe this is your chance to figure out what you really want." It was not consolation. It was verdict. I don't replay that exact moment because it still hurts with the specificity of an ice pick. Worse than the job was the cold verification that the person I trusted most could choose a life that didn't include me. Worse than that was finding out the reason Jenna's yoga nights, which she described as self-care, were actually an arrangement with Mark, my oldest friend, the man who'd stood up next to me at the wedding and taught me how to change tires. The betrayal didn't bloom overnight, it had been cultivated, watered in secret until it sprouted. When she left, she took half the furniture and the SUV and all the comfortable assumptions about my future. The house sold quick, she said it was easier that way. Mark texted, then went quiet. People I'd helped got awkward. Even the barista who'd spelled my name wrong for years stopped chatting. The city doesn't kick you hard when you fall, it steps aside and pretends it never noticed. I rented a small apartment above a laundromat, took night shifts unloading at a third-rate distribution center, and let the public shame scab over. In the first month I tried to be the kind of tragic hero you pity. I drank more than I should have. I called friends and let them say, "Man, that sucks," and then never come by. I might have collapsed into that script had something not shifted in me. There's a particular clarity that comes when your credit cards stop working and your daughter's tuition notice sits in the mailbox. The clarity is cold and quiet: survive, then rebuild. If you're smart, you plant the seeds of new luck while everyone else assumes you're dead. I started small. I took every night job I could find and learned to love labor for its honesty. I fixed things, not because I liked it but because broken things taught me how things held together. I read management books that felt like therapy and watched videos about small business startups at 3 a.m. Little by little, my hands learned the language of restoration, ordering materials, negotiating with vendors, calming a frantic staffer with better coffee. I kept my head down, kept every scrap of pay, and every small favor I did for someone came back tenfold later. A year after the meeting that ruined me, I had an offer. Not from Ridgefield, obviously. From a tiny logistics startup with a messy spreadsheet and ambition to burn. They wanted an operations director who could make chaos look like a plan. They wanted results. I wanted a shot to prove that zeros on a paycheck don't define me. I signed the contract and moved offices from the warehouse dock to an under-renovation loft above a hardware store. We turned a broken blueprint into a profitable route by the end of the first season. Clients are hungry for people who get things done. Once you prove you can deliver, the world stops asking about past mistakes. I celebrated the first big win with a burger and a beer at a bar that smelt of motor oil and fried onions. I was working late the next night when my assistant buzzed me. "David, there's someone here asking for you. Says he knows you." I expected panhandlers, former colleagues shuffling in for a handout, or a headhunter with a tricky pitch. I didn't expect Mark. He walked in like someone who'd rehearsed humility behind closed doors. His shirt didn't fit right, his hair was thinner, and he had that look men get when their world becomes a ledger of losses. He smiled at me with the same easy grin he'd used for years and said, "Dave, I heard you were hiring." I could really use work. If revenge is a dish, most people picture a scream or an onstage humiliation. But I had learned better than screaming. I had learned the power of patience. I told him, "We might have something. Sit down." As he took the chair, I thought of the long road that had brought me here, the nights on the loading dock, the boring hours reading vendor clauses, the small kindnesses I'd banked. I thought of Jenna's casual cruelty and Mark's convenience. I thought of what it would mean to hand a man his wages when he had once stolen my home. It would be easy to burn him, to kick him to the curb. But easy isn't always the most effective form of justice. Sometimes you want to give a man enough rope to hang himself. Sometimes you want him to remember the face of the man who chose how to treat him. I poured him a cup of coffee and told him about the job. He listened, gratitude on his face, not knowing yet whether he was being offered redemption or a reckoning. I had plans. But plans require time, the right tools, and a steady hand. This was only the opening move. The board was set. The pieces were moving. The game had begun. Mark started the following Monday. I gave him the kind of position I would have scoffed at years ago, inventory coordinator. The title sounded respectable enough, but the work was the same as what rookies did on their first day, counting shipments, logging invoices, stacking pallets, updating spreadsheets until his eyes blurred. I didn't want him anywhere near the actual decision-making. He didn't know it yet, but I was placing him at the bottom rung on purpose. If he wanted to climb, I'd make sure every step up would feel heavier than the last. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. I've had enough sleepless nights to understand that vengeance without purpose rots in your hands. I wanted something more precise. I wanted him to learn exactly what it meant to rely on another man's goodwill. The same way I had to learn how to swallow my pride when unloading boxes at 3 a.m. just to keep the lights on. If Mark was going to work for me, he'd have to sweat for every scrap of stability he got. The first week, he was all gratitude. Every thank you was wrapped in the kind of humble smile people wear when they're desperate to prove they're still worth something. He stayed late, didn't complain about the hours, even offered to pick up other people's shifts. He was trying to charm his way into my trust the same way he'd once charmed his way into Jenna's. But I'd stopped being the man who fell for smooth words. I watched instead for the moments when fatigue chipped at his performance. By the third week, those cracks began to show. He'd mix up shipments, mislabel boxes, or take longer breaks than the schedule allowed. I'd correct him, calmly, in front of the team. Not to humiliate him, at least, not entirely, but to make sure everyone knew he wasn't untouchable. Pride is a funny thing. It can drive a man to excel, or it can push him into corners where his own mistakes feel like someone else's fault. Outside the warehouse, my life had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. The company was growing. Our routes were expanding into 2 more states, and investors were sniffing around. I'd traded the cramped apartment above the laundromat for a modest townhouse with a spare room for when my daughter visited. I was eating better, sleeping better, and most importantly, feeling the slow, steady return of my self-respect. But I wasn't in any hurry to let go of the past. That's the thing most people get wrong about moving on. They think it means forgetting. It doesn't. Moving on means carrying your history like a knife in your pocket, out of sight, but always within reach if you need it. One rainy Thursday evening, Mark lingered after his shift. The warehouse was quiet, just the hum of the refrigeration units and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the tin roof. He leaned on my office doorframe, looking smaller than I remembered. "Dave," he said, I know I wasn't there for you when everything went down. I can't undo that. But I'm trying now." I let the silence stretch. He shifted from foot to foot, waiting for absolution I had no intention of giving. "Trying is good," I finally said, keeping my tone neutral. "But in this place, trying isn't enough. Results are what matter." He nodded, like a student who just got a passing grade when he'd been aiming for praise. He left without another word. It was around that time I started hearing rumors, whispers from a few of our mutual acquaintances, that Mark and Jenna hadn't exactly landed in the happily ever after they'd pictured. She'd left him, apparently, for someone else. Moved out of state. Took whatever savings they'd built and didn't look back. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt nothing. Maybe a flicker of satisfaction, but mostly just the hollow acknowledgement that sometimes the people who hurt you eventually hurt themselves without your help. Still, I knew an opening when I saw one. A man who's been abandoned twice is a man whose loyalty can be bought, but also one who can be tested. And I intended to test him. I offered him more responsibility, just a little. Put him in charge of coordinating with one of our mid-size clients. It was grunt work with a title enough to make him feel he was moving up, but still under my thumb. Predictably, he accepted without hesitation. For a while, he handled it fine. Then, slowly, the old Mark started to bleed through, cutting corners, skipping double checks, relying on charm instead of diligence. One Friday afternoon, a shipment got sent to the wrong address, an expensive mistake that cost us 3 days and a chunk of goodwill with the client. When I confronted him, he tried to deflect, blaming a junior staffer. I called him out, plainly, in my office. "You're not here to point fingers, Mark. You're here to make sure mistakes don't happen. Own it, or this isn't going to work." He stared at me for a long moment, jaw tight, before muttering, "Fine. It's on me." That was the crack I'd been waiting for. Not the mistake itself, but the moment he realized he couldn't charm his way out of accountability. Over the next few weeks, I made sure those moments multiplied. Each time he faltered, I didn't fire him, I just tightened the leash. More oversight. More mundane tasks. More reminders, subtle but constant, that his place here depended entirely on my choice to keep him. I wasn't doing this out of pettiness, though I won't pretend there wasn't some grim satisfaction in it. I was building something. A situation where he'd have to face the reality of what he'd done, not just to me, but to himself. Every man has a point where he looks in the mirror and sees the sum of his choices staring back at him. I wanted to make sure Mark reached that point. And then, one cold morning in late November, that point came closer than I expected. A major client called me directly, urgent, panicked. There was a problem with a shipment Mark had overseen. Not a small problem. A problem that could unravel a contract worth nearly a quarter of our annual revenue. As I hung up the phone and looked out over the warehouse floor, I saw Mark at his station, shuffling paperwork, unaware of the storm heading his way. My hand hovered over the intercom button, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about choice. About deciding what kind of man I wanted to be when the game finally ended. I called him into my office. The look on his face as he stepped through the doorway told me he knew something was wrong, but not yet how wrong. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk and stayed silent until he sat. Then I leaned forward. "We've got a problem," I said, my voice calm, deliberate. "A big one." He swallowed, eyes flicking to the paperwork in front of me. "Is this about the Parker account?" "It is. The client says their shipment never arrived. The tracking shows it sitting in a distribution hub 2 states away." "And the paperwork?" I tapped the stack between us. "It's a mess. Missing signatures, wrong waitlisted, no insurance documentation." Mark shifted in his seat, opening his mouth, but I cut him off before he could start the dance of excuses. "Don't say it's someone else's fault. Don't tell me the system glitched or a driver got lazy. This has your name on it, and you're going to fix it." He bristled. "I'll fix it, but you don't have to talk to me like." "Like what?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Like an employee who's one mistake away from costing me a quarter of my revenue for the year?" For a long second, he didn't speak. His jaw worked, and his eyes darted to the blinds, to the floor, anywhere but my face. Finally, he muttered, "I'll handle it." I let him go, watching him stalk out like a man heading toward a storm he couldn't steer around. I didn't micromanage his fix, but I kept my ear to the ground. Over the next 3 days, I saw him scramble, calls at all hours, pleading with freight coordinators, driving halfway across the state to intercept the shipment himself. He got it delivered in the end, but not without the client breathing down my neck the entire time. When the dust settled, I called him in again. This time, he walked in slower, the fight drained from him. He sat without being told. "You pulled it off," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But the damage is done. They're keeping the contract, for now, but they've made it clear they'll be watching every move we make." He nodded, silent. You know what the real problem is here? I continued. It's not the mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The problem is trust. And right now, I can't give you anything that requires trust without wondering if it's going to blow up in my face. Something shifted in his expression, anger, maybe, but also shame. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just said, "What do you want me to do?" That was the moment I realized the balance had shifted. He wasn't here as my former rival anymore. He wasn't even here as an equal. He was here as someone who depended on me, and he knew it. Over the next few weeks, I used that shift. Not cruelly, but deliberately. I gave him more of the grunt work. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because I wanted him to rebuild from the bottom up, the same way I'd had to after everything fell apart for me. He stacked crates, audited invoices, double-checked loading lists. Slowly, he got better. More careful. More thorough. Almost like he understood that there were no shortcuts left. Outside of work, I started noticing something else. He didn't have the same circle of friends anymore. The people who'd laughed with him at my expense years ago were nowhere to be found. I'd see him eating lunch alone in the break room, scrolling through his phone, staring at nothing. Once, I caught him lingering in the parking lot after his shift, sitting in his car long after everyone else had left. His world had gotten smaller, and I was one of the few constants left in it. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just past 11 p.m. when my phone rang. Mark's number. I almost didn't pick up, figuring it was some minor issue that could wait until morning. But something made me answer. His voice was tight, almost panicked. "Dave. I need help." I was out of bed and pulling on jeans before I even knew what I was doing. "Where are you?" "Downtown," he said. "Near the old freight depot. My car broke down and, look, I can't explain right now, but I really need you to come." There was something in his tone that told me this wasn't just about a busted engine. 20 minutes later, I pulled up to find him leaning against the hood, his face pale under the streetlight. The car looked fine. Too fine. "What's going on?" I asked. He glanced around like he was making sure we were alone. "I screwed up," he said. "Not at work. Outside. I borrowed money from the wrong people. Thought I could flip it quick on a side job. It didn't work out. They're coming for me." I just stared at him. This was a side of Mark I hadn't seen before, not the smug opportunist, not the overconfident charmer, but a man with fear in his eyes. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" I asked. "Just help me figure a way out," he said. "I don't have anyone else to call." It hit me then how far he'd fallen. How far we both had, once, but in different directions. And for the first time since I'd hired him, I had to decide whether my revenge was worth letting him sink, or whether I was going to throw him the lifeline he'd never offered me. The rain started falling again, light at first, then harder, drumming on the hood between us. He stood there, waiting for my answer, shivering slightly under the weight of his own choices. And I knew whatever I decided in that moment was going to end this story one way or another. I didn't answer right away. The rain was coming down harder now, streaking the windshield of my truck, soaking through my shirt. Mark's eyes kept flicking toward the empty street like he expected headlights to appear at any moment. "Get in the truck," I finally said. He hesitated, probably wondering if I was about to drive him straight to whoever he owed. But he opened the door and slid in. The silence between us was heavy as I pulled away from the curb. "Start talking," I said once we were moving. "It was supposed to be quick," he began. "A buddy of mine said he knew a guy buying scrap metal at triple the going rate. Said I could get in on it if I fronted the cash for the haul. I didn't have it, so I borrowed." I shot him a look. "Borrowed from who?" He didn't answer right away, and that was answer enough. I knew the type, guys who didn't deal in contracts or grace periods, who collected debts in blood if money wasn't an option. "How much?" 15, he said quietly. 1,500? He shook his head. 1,000. I let out a low whistle. "And I'm guessing you don't have it." "No." The wipers swiped back and forth, a steady metronome to the storm brewing in both our heads. I could have told him this wasn't my problem. I could have dropped him at the nearest police station and washed my hands of him. But there was something about the way he sat there, shoulders slumped, hands clenched, like a man finally realizing he'd burned his last bridge, that made me keep driving. "Where's the medal now?" I asked. "Gone," he said. "Guy disappeared with it. Probably never even had a buyer lined up." Of course. It was the kind of scam people like Mark used to pull on others. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I pulled into the warehouse lot. My warehouse. It was midnight, the place dark except for the security lights casting pale cones across the loading bays. "What are we doing here?" he asked. "You said you needed a way out," I said, killing the engine. "Let's see if I can find one that doesn't end with you in a ditch." Inside, the smell of oil and steel filled the air. I walked to the back, unlocked a storage cage, and flicked on the overhead light. Rows of neatly wrapped equipment gleamed under the bulbs, forklift parts, spare generators, heavy-duty cable. "Here's the deal," I said, turning to him. "I've got contacts who'll buy some of this, no questions asked. You help me move it tonight, I'll get you enough cash to pay them off. But after that, you work for me, really work for me, until I say otherwise. No complaints, no shortcuts, no screwing me over." He stared at the gear, then at me. "You're asking me to steal from you." "I'm asking you to steal from me," I corrected. "There's a difference. This is my stock. My choice." For a long moment, I thought he'd refuse. But finally, he nodded. We loaded the truck in the pounding rain, the night swallowing our movements. The whole time, I kept thinking about the reversal of roles, how, years ago, I'd been the desperate one, and he'd been the man holding the cards. Now it was me deciding whether he'd get to keep breathing easy. By 3 a.m., the deal was done. We drove back in silence, the envelope of cash heavy in his lap. I pulled into his driveway and put the truck in park. "There it is," I said. 15 grand. Paid in full. You take that, you settle your debt, and you remember exactly who bailed you out." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "Why? After everything I did to you, why would you do this?" I could have told him it was because I was a better man. I could have told him it was about forgiveness. But the truth was simpler and colder. "Because now you owe me," I said. The words seemed to sink into him like a weight. He nodded once, got out of the truck, and walked toward his door without looking back. As I drove away, I knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't about evening the score anymore, it was about control. He'd taken years from me, my career, my pride. Now, every step he took from here on out would be in a shadow I'd cast. And if he ever forgot that, well, I'd be there to remind him. 3 months passed. 3 long, quiet months where Mark kept his head down. He showed up to the warehouse at dawn, did every task I threw at him, and left without a word. He didn't complain when the jobs were dirty, or when I made him work weekends. He didn't even argue when I docked his pay for equipment damage that was just me testing if he'd push back. At first, I thought maybe he'd changed. Maybe nearly losing everything had finally knocked the arrogance out of him. But then I started hearing whispers, little things from guys on the floor, about Mark taking calls outside, about small items going missing from shipments. The old Mark wasn't gone. He was just biding his time. I decided it was time to end this, once and for all. One Friday evening, I called him into my office. The sun was setting behind him, casting a long shadow across the floor as he stepped inside. He looked tired, maybe from the double shifts I'd been piling on him, maybe from whatever schemes he was cooking up on the side. "You wanted to see me?" he asked. "Yeah." "Close the door." He did, and I slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photos, grainy, but clear enough to make out. Mark, unloading crates into the back of a rusted van. The crates were mine. The van wasn't. His face paled. "Where did you?" "Security cameras," I cut in. "You remember the ones you tried to have disconnected?" "Yeah, those." Turns out I had a separate feed running to a private server. Just in case. He didn't say anything. You know what the cops would call this? I continued. Grand larceny. Repeat offense. And considering who you owe money to, I doubt prison would be much safer than the streets. Still nothing. He was waiting to see if I'd bluff, if I'd let him slide one more time. I leaned forward. Here's your choice, Mark. You can walk out that door right now, no paycheck, no references, nothing, and I hand this over to the police. Or, I paused, letting the silence press in. Or you sign this. I slid another document toward him. This one was a contract legally binding, drawn up by a lawyer I trusted. It made him my operations manager on paper, but in reality, it gave me control over his income, his work schedule, even certain aspects of his finances. He couldn't quit without my consent. He couldn't take another job without my approval. It wasn't just employment, it was ownership. His eyes scanned the page, and I could see the realization hit him. This is slavery, he said quietly. No, I said. This is justice. You took years from me, Mark. You left me with nothing while you built yourself up on my work. Now it's my turn. You get to live, you get to work, you get to eat, but you do it all on my terms. Forever. The rain started again outside, soft at first, then harder, rattling against the window. Mark stared at the paper for a long time. His hand shook as he picked up the pen. He didn't look at me as he signed. When it was done, I took the contract and locked it in my desk. Welcome to the rest of your life, I said. He stood there for a moment, then walked out without a word. I watched him through the glass, his shoulders hunched, his steps slow. I knew he hated me now more than ever. I knew he'd fantasize about getting back at me. But the beauty of it was, he couldn't. Not legally. Not without destroying himself in the process. For the first time since he fired me all those years ago, I felt a real, bone-deep satisfaction. This wasn't just revenge, it was balance. And every morning when he walked into my warehouse, I'd be reminded of one simple truth. Sometimes, the best payback isn't destroying someone. It's making sure they live with the weight of their own mistakes, one day at a time.